Today, after untenable delays and inaction from the government, I am launching legal proceedings in the Federal Court of Australia. After the window dressing of parliamentary workplace reforms has been put in place, the government is now testing in real time exactly what it can still get away with. But if the government won't hold its own poor behaviour to account, then I will ask the courts to do that.
Dirty laundry, just what the Albanese government doesn't need as it enters the final week of federal parliament for the year and possibly for the term.
Hello, Joe Tarnowski. I'm the Chief of Staff.
Joe Tarnowski is the Chief of Staff to Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles. You may remember allegations emerging a couple of months ago about how she had been locked out of her office amid a bullying dispute. Now, with no resolution in sight, Ms Tarnowski has filed a claim against the Commonwealth, Marles and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff Tim Gartrell over their handling of the bullying dispute.
Jo exercised a protected workplace right when she raised directly with the Deputy Prime Minister her concerns about bullying behaviour by senior members of his staff. Her treatment as a result of bringing forward that concern constitutes adverse action, we allege, which is unlawful.
A government spokesperson says this matter is subject to legal proceedings and it would not be appropriate to comment further. But it is yet another bad headline as the government engages in a strange round of humiliating backdowns on the one hand and, on the other, defiant attempts to get through some of its stalled, blocked or frustrated legislative agenda.
I move that the Senate adopt the recommendation in the report and that the bill be withdrawn and immediately discharged from the notice paper.
First, the government announced it would not be proceeding with its so-called misinformation and disinformation bills. That's the legislation that would put legal obligations on social media platforms to address false, misleading or deceptive content, but it was opposed by a range of groups on freedom of speech grounds. Wedged in behind that announcement was news it would now not be bringing forward long-mooted anti-gambling legislation.
This is gutless. This is absolutely gutless from the Albanese government. And it's a huge win for Peter V'landys and the gambling industry.
We've also made it very clear that the status quo is untenable, but we continue to engage with stakeholders on our response to what is an important issue.
The government is having some successes on issues where the coalition is on board. Long-awaited reforms to the aged care system passed the parliament today. Much criticised changes to electoral donations laws, which favour the major parties, will get through, with the support of the major parties. An equally contentious social media ban on under 16-year-olds, contentious with many in principle and with many on the details, will also go through with coalition support.
Leaders of European and North American and other countries in our own region as well, including Prime Minister Luxon of New Zealand last week. They are all looking at what we are doing and they are applauding what we are doing.
With a widespread expectation that the Parliament may not return next year before an election is called, many MPs are unsure about the government's legislative priorities.
Today, I'm really proud to introduce the Future Made in Australia Production Tax Credits and Other Measures Bill 2024.
The government's Future Made in Australia plan promises targeted incentives to make Australia more resilient to the sort of supply chain breakdowns we saw during the pandemic and to maximise opportunities in a net zero economy. However, it involves no less than 6 pieces of legislation, some of which have been sitting in the House for months, others sitting in the Senate for just as long, while one final bill was introduced into the House today. The prospects for any of them passing before the current Parliament ends seem remote.
Look, I'm really confused about why the government is taking the approach it has. It's saying it can't touch gambling, too complicated, but is rushing through, world-leading, world-changing social media laws. It says it's trying to do best-in-class electoral reform, the most profound for 40 years, and it pushed through the House within 3 or 4 days.
Allegra Spender is watching the government's actions from her place on the House of Representatives crossbench.
I mean, this is not probity and this is not good governance. If they need more time, bring us back a week, bring us back early, but let's get the legislation done right.
But it's on some of the big issues where the government has until now been opposed by the Greens that the big blockages have been apparent. The most notable of these has been on housing. Last week, Treasurer Jim Chalmers announced a new investment mandate for the Future Fund. That's essentially a letter to the fund that doesn't direct it to invest in particular assets, but suggests it would be a really good idea if it did.
The Future Fund will still focus primarily on maximising its returns, but this will make sure that we can also maximise our opportunities in the context of our national economic interest as well.
The announcement did not go down all that well with some, attracting criticism from former Prime Minister John Howard, former Treasurer Peter Costello and former Future Fund head David Murray.
Look, I think some of the criticisms are overblown, personally, but I believe that honestly, the Future Fund should make up its own mind in terms of what is attractive to invest in or not.
Allegra Spender last week released a green paper on tax reform designed to set some markers for a debate in the next term of Parliament. She says that while you can argue about changing the mandate of the Future Fund, the bigger question concerns the underlying tax setting influencing big investors.
Like everybody else, I'd love to see the Future Fund, investing, in housing and certainly in clean energy. But I think the major role for government in this space is to make sure that those investments really stack up in terms of return and make they're attractive to the Future Fund as well as other investors.
You get the sense that part of Jim Chalmers' move on the Future Fund last week may have been to just use any option available to him to try to get investment in housing moving. But after months of delay, late this afternoon, the Greens blinked.
There comes a point where you've pushed as hard as you can. We tried hard to get Labor to act on negative gearing and soaring rent increases, but we couldn't get there this time. We'll wave through Labor's housing bills